Professor Xu and I would do this a little bit differently this afternoon, and we just grab a few minutes of your time at the end of the program to focus on an interactive exchange and dialogue about maybe some of the questions that you have about doing business in China, and talk about some of the bigger picture things or anything that you actually would like to talk about. And our concept was maybe to introduce to you what Chung Kung Graduate School of Business is, because many of you may know it, but I think even more of you are not familiar with the school. And Professor Xu has also prepared some additional slides different from this morning, and talking about the role of government in China. Because if any of you are thinking of going to China, it's very important that you understand where your project is, federal, municipal, provincial, or municipal level, and have many different questions that are related to that. So let me first talk a little bit very quickly about our school, and then we'll open it up for discussions and maybe have a few slides and talk about the government and the importance of government as you consider approaching China. And we have talked with CEAL about organizing next year a sort of a study business trip to China, which we anticipate would be approximately a week, and the mornings would be academic sessions and the afternoons would be visits to various businesses. And depending upon what industries are represented from you that participate in the group, we would try to set up meetings that would make more sense to you. For example, if there's a financial group with ICBC, which is the largest bank in the world, et cetera, et cetera. So let me just introduce very quickly our school. As you can see from this, we were established in 2012, so we're relatively young, but we've grown very rapidly on the global stage. We were privately funded by a tycoon, Li Ka-shing. Many of you may know who he is. He's probably the most famous and the wealthiest business tycoon in all of Asia. He wanted to establish, together with our dean, Sheng Bing, a school. Their vision was one that was faculty governed, which is what most of the business schools are throughout the world, a private school and a not-for-profit school. We pride ourselves on our faculty. There are 40 or more full-time professors. Of that, more than half are professors that have been tenured at top global institutions around the world and have come back to China to teach. That means there's a global understanding and certainly a bilateral understanding between the Americas and, I should say, multilateral because many countries, but between our continent and China. There are many awards by all the faculty, and we're a research business school, which means we have more than 400 cases, many of which are unpublished. This is one of the magazines. This is the magazine that we publish. It's recognized globally, and if you're interested, please leave your business card with either myself or Alan Chen, and we'll make sure you get on the list to receive it. I think the other very important thing which differentiates Chung Kung Graduate School of Business, again, CKGSB, is that we have some very, very outstanding alum. Pictured here is, of course, Jack Ma from Alibaba, Chen Yidan from Tencent, and I should say that people from Chen Yidan has been back to more than one class. You know, over 50% of our 10,000 plus alumni are CEO or chairman level. And in fact, they lead 1/5 of China's most valuable brands. And there was a calculation done, I think it was in 2015, that said if you add up all the assets of the companies that are owned by our alum, it was equal to about 14% of the GDP of China. So our alum are very powerful. It's a very strong network, and we are well recognized in China, and we're becoming more and more global in our approach and also with the different programs that we are developing. This is just a network of people that we've worked with or done custom programs for, companies that we visited. These are different. We have a campus in Beijing, our main campus, and Shanghai and Shenzhen. And then we have 3 centers, New York, London, and Hong Kong. That's Dr. Henry Kissinger, who spoke at our annual conference last year. Different examples of programs that we have. I just want to highlight the Chuang community, which is an extraordinary startup area for young entrepreneurs. And there are stories after story after story about some of the successful companies that have developed out of that, all the way from baby goods to English teaching to internet. These are global programs, which is going very quickly, but we do all of these things. And we partner here in Mexico and Latin America with Inkai and IPADE, and these are all schools, Yale School, Darden School of Business, Columbia, NYU, Cornell, that we work with in the United States to develop programs or, in fact, educate them about China on immersion programs in China, which is sort of what we're talking about with CEAL. If you have any questions about that or about your interests, both Professor Xu and I would be very happy to see if we could answer. How many people have been to China? Oh, that's great. Oh, that's wonderful. Are you planning on going back? That's great. You don't know. You know, it's very interesting because one of the things I think is important, a lot of people, you know, the 19th Congress is coming up, and that's the next 5-year plan for China. And one thing that people often do if you want to really know the direction that the Chinese government is going is to read that plan and what businesses they're going to attract, what businesses they're going to encourage through taxes and through different centers. Have any of you been to Shenzhen? So mostly to Beijing or Shanghai, right? Yeah.
We made some business with China, buying some equipment in the energy sector and hydroelectric, and we had a fantastic experience, especially that we had somebody there that can help us out. They knew how to move around in these technical areas, producers of equipment for hydro projects, and he was actually a doctor in engineering and very respected person. And we did at the end, we had a fantastic ending with the project. Even though the language is still a problem, but we had people who could help us out. With the university, with this person, we had the chance to have serious people involved in the production of the equipment for the plant.
Is this hydroelectric power?
Hydroelectric powered equipment, all the equipment bought, and the electromechanical bought in China.
Did you manufacture the turbines?
They did.
They did?
Yeah.
In Harbin, or did you go down to Harbin? There's some very famous factories for hydroelectric
it's a small, medium-sized factories. Now through this person, we got we could say one of the best equipment in the area. And we are happy with the equipment. It's very strong equipment, and it's working. We haven't had any problem yet.
That's great. I know Voith in Germany did a lot of work in the hydro area. Yeah.
Just to mention the capacity of the people and the producers in China.
That's great.
But it's good to have somebody in the university that can help you out, because at the end, people respect people coming from the university, and we got the help of a guy doctor in engineering from the university to help us out over there.
Right. Quite often, it's very helpful to have someone from the university to give a talk on that specific area, and then it attracts and learns the technical people, and then you're able to make a sell not only to the commercial and marketing people, but directly to the technical people. Has anyone else had a bad experience or another? Yeah.
Just quickly, I think myself as an entrepreneur, for example, there's always a learning curve in China, and my main question is always how can you assess general in terms of quality control of the products that you outsource at some point, and in terms of the way when you start dealing with, let me rephrase the question. As you grow a business and you start requiring more scale out of producers in China, there's always that steep curve in which, you know, quality starts becoming an issue. Structures for financing start becoming an issue. The whole legal structures start becoming an issue. So in general terms, I don't know if that's a little bit on the presentation, but how to go about, I guess is my question, in terms of debt financing possibilities in China, as well as the optimal legal structures in a general sense that you can do in order for contracts to be enforced, or that you can actually do something about it, or maybe general recommendations.
I don't know if you want to comment, Professor Xu, on that at all.
It's hard for me to listen to the echo. So I guess if there's no, it's hard to.
No, maybe we can. If you have the presentation, a couple of
Sure.
slides, maybe I'll ask it afterwards, because maybe it's covered there.
Sure. Well, the question was basically a sort of a dual question, a complicated question, which is basically how do you assess quality control? And then in addition to that, he felt that it was sort of on a seat curve. It was very good in the beginning and then sort of got worse. And secondly, he felt that, you know, how do you really deal with corporate governance issues and legal issues? And I'm happy to comment on some, maybe you can.
But here, when you use the term quality control, you mean the quality control within the firm or the quality standard is regulation, the government regulation?
No, just in terms of importing products and just in general terms, how do you go about quality assessment within plants and everything there? But I guess most importantly is how do you enforce legal contracts over there?
Okay, right. China is a is a complex economy. There's no single standard. So when we talk about the quality issue, it depends very much on who is the producer. So it depends on the firm. You do have some of the high quality firms, and at the same time, you have a very large number of firms which have mediocre quality. So it depends. And if the quality issue is about general safety, if it's about government regulation, then overall the regulatory agents in China doesn't work very well. So it's still a developing country. And then if we are talking about enforcement of rules or enforcement of contracts, then you touch upon the key issue, one of the key issues in China, which is the lack of judicial independence. So because there is no judicial independence, So therefore, the enforcement of contracts is highly problematic. In some areas, you see some progresses at the margin, but it depends on either the contract enforcements involve state-owned firms and the government or not. So if there's no state government involved, if there's no state-owned firms involved, then relatively speaking, it might be relatively easier if none of the private firms deeply involved with the government, but it depends. So since there is no judicial independence. Yeah. Yeah.
My question, we've been involved for 5 generations involved in construction, and as we have seen through these years, lately these years, for example, we have a solar plant here in Baja California, and this electricity that you're seeing here, some of the products are coming now from China for the solar panels. And working in Mexico, we just finished one of the, I would say, the tallest building in Mexico. And at that stage, it wasn't so technical, but we're having products also coming from China in the steel industry. My question is, looking into the future and the ways things are running today with the US, how do you foresee the future of Chinese products, especially my industry, which is the construction industry, coming to our country? What will be the benefits in the future of your products coming to our country?
So here you specifically you talk about these solar panels.
No, I'm talking about general construction products, no?
Right.
Steel or whatever good
Right.
products that will be coming to Mexico
Right.
in the years to come from China.
Right. Here, in general, if we are talking about heavy machineries, construction machineries, those kind of, and steel, as you mentioned, if we are talking about this kind of products, then the both quality and quantity from China should be reliable and improving. So it depends on which sector we are talking about. So the Chinese nowadays are reasonably good in heavy machineries, and they are very keen to export more heavy machines as they have overcapacity problem. The overcapacity problem doesn't mean they have low quality. It only means they produce too much. So in that sector alone, you expect is reliable quality.
I would add in some cases, there's a negotiation at a government-to-government level for certain commodities and certain goods. And then at another level, there's a negotiation from company to company. So you need to assess, as you look forward in the next 5 years, whether what you're interested is going to be a government-to-government negotiation, and then certain things would apply, or whether it's going to be, whether you need to go yourself and negotiate or identify a partner or a supplier. And they can be in different levels of the government, depending on the product.
Throughout this year, especially over the last few months, I've read a lot about how President Xi Jinping has been maintaining an economic stability in China so that we can get to this Communist Party Congress and he can consolidate his power. So my question to you is, given within a frame of large macroeconomic imbalances in China that the Western economic press at least seems to believe it's unsustainable. So my question to you is that true? What's going to happen after he consolidates power, which it seems like he will be able to do? And is that going to affect the world economy, the Latin American economy in some meaningful way?
Right. The sustainability of the Chinese economic growth has been a problem. It's not just the recent. The underlying reason for questioning the sustainability of the Chinese growth is very simple. It's because the domestic demand is too low. And the reason the domestic demand is too low is simply because over the last 2 decades, every year, the government revenue, the increasing rate of the government revenue has been much higher than the growth rate of GDP, which means the government took away a large chunk of the wealth. So then if we look at the total household income over GDP ratio, China is among the lowest in the whole world, among all countries together. So roughly, in almost all the other countries, the ratio should be half. Take the United States as an example. Over many years, decades, the ratio is about 60%. So then what is the number in China? In China, it's 1/3. It's so much lower. It's lower than any other countries. So when the household income is that low, then no wonder the household consumption over GDP ratio is very low. So then as a consequence, the number I cited was not accurate. The number what I cited should be the household consumption over GDP ratio. So the household consumption over GDP ratio was only 1/3. And if we look at other countries, it's half or 60%. So when the domestic demand is that low, before the global financial crisis, the Chinese growth was driven by exporting. But since the financial crisis, the international trade, overall, the global trade declined. So then China doesn't have that much demand anymore. So then what are the factors which will help China to sustain the growth rate? That's the stimulus package, which started from 2009. So every year, they launch this stimulus package. So in the recent 5 years, they don't use the term anymore. So nominally, they say, we don't have a stimulus package, but in reality, they just use different names, and then they borrow. And that is why, on the one hand, you find that they barely surviving at something like 6.5% of the growth rate. On the other hand, they have very high debts. So the credit over GDP ratio has been accelerating. Now China has among the highest total credit over GDP ratio in the world. So the acceleration of this leverage is a major problem. So that's why the sustainability of the growth and the stability of the economy, of the financial system, this pair is a major concern. And about the growth rate, independent economists have different figures about China's growth rate. For example, one of the leading economists who is now teaching in Japan, a Chinese economist teaching in Japan, so his estimation of China's growth rate is something like 3.5. It's much lower than the official number. And so basically that's the situation. So on the one hand, they rely on huge stimulus package to sustain the growth. On the other hand, the number, there are debates about the number. And within China, some official economists or statisticians would argue that the reason the 6.7 or whatever growth rate is believable is not because in this year, indeed, the growth rate was 6.7. It's because they are smoothing. Smoothing means the National Statistical Bureau, in the past, they constantly manipulate data. So when the growth rate was high, they report lower. When the growth rate was low, they report higher. So then they smooth out. So that's part of the interpretation, why in reality, the growth rate may not be 6.7, but they could report 6.7. Yeah, they make adjustments. Right. So here, one of the key issues is unemployment associated with slowing down. Till now, it's not clear yet about increasing unemployment. But indeed, the government worries a lot. So although we don't have the data yet to see that, but they do worry. They do worry this. And just a few days ago, there was a major announcement from the central bank, the People's Bank of China, that they are going to relax money supply. And the estimation is that they might increase money supply by 6 trillion RMB, which reflects the worries about unemployment. But on the other hand, the debt GDP ratio is going to getting worse, right? And that's the reason why in the morning I briefly mentioned that reforming the institution is the key for long-run growth. Yes?
Professor Yu, my question was related to the Chinese automobile industry. How do you see them competing in the next few years, namely against the Korean, the Japanese, and do you see them in any way attempting to leapfrog, like it happened in the chip industry, but to leapfrog towards electronic cars as a means of exporting, and particularly in our region?
Right. The car industry is on the edge of a revolution, right? Because Germany has already made an announcement, and then several EU countries made an announcement that they are going to stop fuel-driven car fairly soon. And then the Chinese may follow. So there is a big bet that the Chinese are going to make electrical cars. Currently, if we count the number of electrical cars, then China is already the largest car maker in making the electrical cars. So producing the traditional diesel or gasoline cars, China actually had some technical difficulties in making good engines. But now transforming the car industry from the fuel-driven to electrical, some Chinese engineers thought they could, even without solving all the problems, now they could produce new types of cars. But then one of the key issues here is the batteries. So the Chinese producers are betting on the current technology, the battery technologies. So then here the problem is that as long as there is a new breakthrough, if the battery technology all of a sudden changes, then China is going to run into troubles. But if there is no new technology, so suppose the current technology is going to continue for next 20 years, then very likely China is going to do very well because they have already invested a huge amount of money there and they are improving on this current technology. So then it's a big bet. It's highly uncertain. And my sense of this technology is that it's most likely that within 10 years, some revolutionary change is going to occur within this area. But if that happened, then China is going to run into troubles. So we don't know yet. We don't have an answer. It's uncertain.
Do we have time for one more question, Emmanuel? Time for one more question? Does anyone have a question? Can I ask one question of Professor Xu? Professor Xu, what keeps you awake at night about the Chinese economy? What would trouble you most?
Right, the stability issue.
The stability.
The stability issue we just briefly mentioned. So nowadays, most investment bankers, central bankers, they worry about the debt over GDP ratio in China. So the number is quite high. And also it's increasing very rapidly. So keeping this trend in the next 2 or 3 years, the number is going to be difficult to be managed. But in my view, that is actually only part of the problems. If we look at the other part of this problem, it's even more severe because when we look at the debt-equity ratio, in most of the market economies, most of the debts are the bonds issued in the markets, right? So you have government bonds, you have corporate bonds, so on and so forth. So once the debts are in the form of bonds in the market, it means that you have a clear definition about the maturity and you don't have other interactions with the economy. But the case of China is different. So in China, most of the debts are not bonds issued in the market. Most of the debts are actually mortgages, bank loans. So bank loans supported by mortgage. For example, most of the mortgages are using land. So we all know what happened in the 2008 global financial crisis, right? It started from the United States, which we call that as subprime mortgage. And the case in China is similar to that. So these are the subprime mortgage. In the case of the US, these are the subprime mortgage of the households. But in China, these are the subprime mortgage of the local governments. That's the difference. But in terms of the scale, it's about similar. And things are still getting worse. So the reason in China you have that huge amount, so here we are talking about something like 40 trillion or 50 trillion RMB mortgage from the local governments, from the municipal governments. The reason the local governments would borrow from banks in this form is because the local governments are not allowed to issue bonds, on the one hand. On the other hand, 90% of the public goods and public services in China are provided by local governments. But on the other hand, the national government would take away most of the physical revenues and asking the local governments to deal with public goods provision, public service provision, without physical revenue. So then they have to borrow. And every time, whenever the national government wants something, they push the local governments to find their way out. So this is actually an invention, is a kind of a financial innovation invented by the Chinese local governments. So they found, because in China, all the lands are owned by the government. But in reality, the local governments controls the land within their jurisdictions. So then the national government will say, look, you have land, solve your problems by using your land. So then they use the land as a collateral, borrow from the bank. That's the way to solve the problem. So then here you see, this is a pro-cyclical instrument, right? So when the economy is getting worse, then the prices of the collaterals, the value of the collateral will drop. So when the value of the collateral drop, then not only the local governments are in trouble, all the banks are going to be in trouble. That is why here, when we look at the Chinese financial stability, you see this deep problem, and it's getting worse. So that's a huge potential problem. But of course, there are different views about this issue. So some people are more optimistic about this. The reason they could be optimistic is because most of these debts are from the government. So then the argument is this. They said, at the end of the day, the central bank can print money. So then, so either you run into financial crisis or you run into hyperinflation, right? So you have a choice. So you could avoid financial crisis by printing money. So that's one way to do it. But basically here we see there are potential, very serious potential problems, but these may not occur very quickly. The reason is also simple, is because currently the Chinese national government still has a huge amount of foreign reserve. Here we are talking about the $3 trillion foreign reserve. And also the national government still has a fairly large physical surplus. But when the economy is running into difficulties, they are using these reserves and the surplus. So over the past year, the reserve has declined and the surplus declined. So if this trend continues, then perhaps 5 years later, 6 years later, when the foreign reserve becomes low and the surplus becomes low, and when there are exogenous shocks, the structure is not stable. So something could happen. But not within 2 or 3 years, but in 5 or 6 years, things could get worse.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I'd just like to say that for those that come to China, we usually traditionally put together some economic courses, some corporate governance, legal courses, some discussions about how best to structure your business. We talk about leadership, globalization, and then we visited Alibaba, ICBC, a number of different companies, Fosun, China Eastern. So we do a combination of state-owned enterprises and private enterprises. And Professor Xu didn't have enough time to get into a discussion of the state-owned enterprises and the private enterprises in China, but that's also something very interesting as you're approaching the market and who you want to pick to either partner with or source from. But again, thank you so much, Professor Xu, and thank you so much, CEAL, for including CKGSB here today.
Yes.